Hello, everybody. So we're going to go over the solution for the Wikistack testing. Before we do it, though, I want to make a couple of modifications which are going to make my testing a little bit easier. I have found it to be helpful. So before we do that, we could just sort of see where we are at this point. We've got our users. I've pre-populated this with some data. We can find similar pages. So this is about JavaScript. If I go similar, I should find a page on destructuring. But what I want to focus here on is I want a little bit more control over when I connect to my database. So before I end up even doing the testing, I want to make a couple of modifications. They're really somewhat minor here. One of the things that I want to do is that instead of going in here and just connecting to this database, I want to have the ability to specify a connection string. And the reason I want to do that is that when I test my application, if I have a database which has data in it, I don't want to wipe out that data. But when I go through my tests, I want to start out with a fresh slate every time I go through. So that's one thing I want to do. The other thing that I want to do is I want to move this. And one of the things that I want to export is that I want to export a connection method. And the way that I'm going to do it is this is going to be a promise. And it's going to be, you could think of this as really being lazy loading in the sense that I'm going to have this variable here called connection, which is underscored. And I'm going to say simply, hey, look, if you have a connection, that's fine. I'm going to return it. And this connection is going to be a promise that whoever is using the connection could resolve. If, in fact, we've opened up the connection, that's fine. But if not, we will open it up. And the way that we're going to do it is that I'm going to have a variable, and I'm going to set it equal to a new promise. A promise gets a resolve and reject. And what I'm going to do when I go in here is I'm going to put in this mongoose connection. Now, one of the things that we're not doing here, we have the ability to do, is that when we connect to Mongo, we can put a callback in here. And at this point, I'm going to resolve my mongoose connection, just so that when we're running this, we're going to end up resolving this with a promise so that we can at least see what the name of the connection is, or see what database we're connected to. So here's my connection, and I'm going to return my connection. So the first time through, there's not going to be a connection. And the second time through, we should be able to get that connection, and we should be able to return it. And again, we're doing it in the form of a promise. So if the promise doesn't exist, create the promise. If it does exist, just return the promise. And it's sort of hard to see what this is going to look like until we end up using it. But let's just make sure that we bring in a couple of things here. Let's bring in our promise library, require Bluebird. And if we go over here, there shouldn't be anything in terms of our app breaking. In fact, if we go over here, what we should see is that we're just not going to end up, if I go back to the home page here, what I should find is I'm just not going to end up seeing any data. So what we need to do here is that since we've actually said, hey, look, we're going to have you connect to the database, there's really just one spot that we need to worry about. And we have our server over here. And what we'll do here is we'll bring in our models, which now has a connect method. We'll require /models. And before I actually start my server, I'll say models, I want to make sure that I could connect. And it's going to use that default connection string. This is going to return a promise. And once I'm actually connected to my database, then I'll start my server. So at this point, we should be able to even go in here and print out some data here, see that this is running. If we actually go back to our terminal, we should see that we're starting. So model is not defined, and it's not model, it's models. And this will run, and we could end up getting some information from this. So one of the things that we might want to just print out, you could look at what all the properties are, maybe just to see what the name of the connection is. And if we go back here, we'll see that the name of our connection, the database that we're connected to, is going to be Wikistack. And this will be interesting because when we end up testing, we want to set our environment so we're not blowing out this database. And just to see that we are, in good shape here, if we go over here, we could go to our index page and we'll see all the pages that we have in our database. So the next thing we're going to need to do is to get our environment set up for testing. So there's two modules that we're going to install here. I could leave the server going. It's not really going to make much of a difference one way or the other. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to, let's see, we'll take this, make sure I'm in the right directory, and I'm going to say npm install, and I'm going to install chai, and I'm going to install Mocha. And I'm going to save, and I don't need this in terms of my application running, but I want it to be a development dependency. So I'm going to say save dev, and it's going to go up and get these modules. Now, we can actually just start running Mocha. Mocha is now installed. It's under our node modules. If we went in and we said node modules Mocha bin Mocha, we'd actually be running Mocha. Maybe node modules. The problem we're going to run into here is that Mocha is expecting a directory called test, which we don't have. We end up creating that directory, and I run this again, what we'll find is that we have this directory, but we don't have any tests. So let's actually start setting this up. We'll go back here. Let me just refresh this view. Here's my test. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a test, and we'll call this test. We'll start out with the user model. It's a little bit simpler. We'll test the user model and the page model. And I'm going to add a file here, and I'm going to call this user model spec.js. One thing that you could just do to sort of get warmed up in terms of writing tests is we're going to need to define expect. We're going to get this from require chai, and we're going to use its expect object, and we'll describe user, right? This is the user model. We give this a callback. So one of the things we could say here is we say, let's describe, these could be nested, existence, should exist. And we'll just say something like it exists. Very simple test. And if you just want it to feel good right off the bat, you could say expect 2 to equal 2. And if we went back in and we ran our test, we'd end up getting a passing test. Now that's not what we want to do. We want to say we expect user. And there's a truthy matcher that's used in chai. We could say to be okay. Okay? And it's going to actually evaluate, and this is going to fail because user doesn't exist. So let's actually get user. The way that we'll get it is we'll say user equals require, and we have to go up a level, models.user. And now we should expect this to pass. Now, one of the things that I find to be pretty helpful is to actually get some data in the database. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do create a method. So for instance, let's say that, just sort of testing something out, let's say we were going to describe users, let's say find all. And I'm going to want to seed the database. So I'm going to say there are 2 users. Now there aren't 2 users, so this is going to fail. But what I'm sort of looking for is to say expect users.length to equal 2. Now, again, this is not going to pass because I don't have any users here. So this fails. One of the things that I want to show you is that you have the ability to do a before each. And this is where I'm actually going to do a couple of things here. I'm actually going to seed my database. But one of the things that you'll see with the before each is that you have the ability to pass into the for each a done object. And if you end up passing this in, let's actually start without it. Let's go up here and we'll say we're going to set up users. And when we get into before each, we'll say users equals, and we'll just give it an array of 1 and 2. And now at this point, the test should pass. If we went over here, and you've seen this before with testing, we have the ability to pass in a done here. So a done, what you're saying here is that something in the before each is going to be asynchronous. That's the reason why you would end up putting that in. And so now if I do this, what will happen is that it'll wait 2 seconds, it'll realize that done's not getting called, and it'll tell me that I need to call it. So if I went over here and called it, that would end up solving the problem. Now what I want to actually do here is that before I end up running any of my tests, what I want to do is I want to seed the database. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a before each. I'm going to pass in a done. And again, if I don't satisfy this done, and the outer before each will happen before the inner, but if I went back here, I would see that I'd be failing again. And what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to call done here, but I'm going to do something a little bit more interesting. So what my goal is to actually go into my, to create a seed file that's going to end up seeding the database. And I'm going to end up getting that file. I'll say seed equals required. This doesn't exist yet. I'm going to create it, .seed. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say seed is going to be I'm going to export a function where I could say seed, then, and then I'm going to call done. Again, that doesn't exist yet, but let's actually go and set that up. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to copy and paste something, but I'll go through exactly what I'm doing here. So here's what my seed file is going to look like. So basically, it's just going to be populating a little bit of data, but let's go through one line at a time here. So first of all, I've got my models, and I need that because I need a way to connect to the database. Here's my user model, here's my page model. And again, I don't want to wipe out my database, which, again, I could be using. I don't want to wipe things out. So what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to specify that this is going to be my connection, process environment connection. And again, if this was being deployed, you could also set that through, like if you were deploying to Heroku, you would end up setting that on Heroku, and you might have some database that's either at Heroku or it could be somewhere else, especially in the case of Mongo. But in this case, what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to connect to the database. I've got my connection here, and this is actually using the native promise library. Let me go in here and say promise require Bluebird, just to be consistent. And so here I'm saying I'm waiting to connect to the database. After I end up connecting to the database, I'm going to remove my two collections. After that, I'm going to create two users. I'm going to get those users back, and I'm going to end up creating a bunch of different pages. So with a bunch of different content here, and I don't actually even need this. This was just for me testing things out. You could just return this. And so now this is going to be a promise. And so if I save this, and we're not actually using the connection here, but if we wanted to, we could do console.log connection.name just to see that we're connected to a different database. And what I'm going to do is that when I end up going into my model spec here, I'm going to be able to specify that I want to seed this, and then when it's done, and I've done this a couple of times, this is not what you want to do. This is the done value that you're getting here, and at this point you could call done. Now again, this should run. If it runs, it should show us, in fact, that we're connected to this database. So we can actually see this is the database that we're using here. Again, it is connecting every time. It's the same connection, but it's just showing us that it's connected. And what we're going to do here is that now that we actually have a legitimate find, and it's not actually find all, it's just find and sequelize, it's find all. But what we can do here is that we can now actually make this asynchronous and say user.find, and then we'll get some users. And we could say users equals the users that we're getting, and then we could say done. And so now we're actually writing a test where we're interacting with the database, and if we run this, we should see that we'll pass. And you always wanted to get a real failing test initially. So, one thing we could do to easily get a failing test is just change our seed file here. So that if we went over here, let's say we'll add a third user, emails are unique. So we could go over here and add a third user, in which case this test is going to fail. And now we can go to green legitimately by doing this. So this is the first test that we're running. Again, it's worth taking the time to set up some data so that you'll have data. There might be you might want to test, that you could end up inserting data and updating data. But to just have some data in the database, it's going to allow us pretty easily to test out some methods that we could test out. For instance, we know we want to be able to find pages based on tag. We also want to have a page object, find similar tags. So these are all things that we're gonna be able to end up testing out, and it makes it a little bit easier now that we have the database seeded. And so you can see the test is fairly clean here. And the next thing that we'll do is we'll take a look and we'll write a couple of tests for the validation of the properties of the user, just to get an idea of how that ends up getting tested. So let's start out by describing a user that doesn't have an email. We'll do a little bit of validation here. So here's our describe with find. Let's go over here and we'll specify that we want to describe a user without an email. And again, one of the things that sometimes helps a lot is just to write your expectation. So we expect to get an error. So one of the things we could do here is we could say it has an error. Now we're going to want to test for the specific type of error. But as a starter, we could just do this. And we could say expect error to, just for starters, to be okay. And if we go back and we run this, we'll find out that error is not defined, but we could go up and say, all right, let's create an error, and let's assume that we're going to test something out. So we'll do a before each. That's going to take a done parameter. And just to sort of get the ball rolling, we'll say error equals some object, and we'll say done. And at this point, our test will pass. So what we really want to do is we want to create a user without an email. So we can go in here and we could say user create, and we could say just give it an empty object, and we could actually catch the error. That's what we expect to happen. We expect to get an error back. And a common thing that I'll do here is I'll even call this error, but just put an underscore in front of it because I don't want to block out my error over here. And instead of setting this to a empty object, I could set it to error. This also gives you an indication of what these errors look like. So if I go to run this, the user has an error, and let's actually just go in and console log this out so we can be a little bit more specific about the error. So we can see that there's an error. We could see that we're going to be focused on the error that's on the email, and we could see that the message is going to be this. So one of the things we could do is I could copy this, and I could be a little bit more specific, and I could say error is equal to the email message, and not just that I expect it to be okay, but I expect it to equal the string path email is required. So it makes it a little bit more specific. Now I could go in here, test this again. So you can't read message of undefined. Let's take a quick look and see. So we could see that this is actually in a property, an errors property, which I failed to notice before. So this is actually going to be the error.errors.email message. And if we run that, we should get that to pass, which it does. So we also know that we could sort of kill this off too, to say that we know that if the name isn't there, we expect to get another error where the name is required. So we could actually save a little bit of time here. And at some point, you don't have to necessarily worry early on about consolidating your tests. In fact, a lot of times it's just not worth the effort. You don't have to refactor your tests a lot. I mean, you could a bit, but here we could say user without a name. And instead of doing email here, we'll say name. And just to get it to fail initially, let's do this. Actually, paste that out just so we can see it. But this is going to be path name is required. Let's just test that out here. So we get that error, path name is required, and we go from red to green. So you're testing out specifically what error message you think you're going to get. And let's actually go and clean this up a little bit. And let's test something else out, which is probably a little bit more interesting. So we know that users are supposed to have unique emails. So let's actually go and test that out. And we'll go, and this is a little bit of a different error message. That's one of the reasons I want to do it here. So we'll say, go in here, and we'll specify a user with an email that exists. Go over here. So let's assume otherwise. We've got a valid user here. And so I'm already in the database. So we'll say ericpkatz@gmail.com. and we'll do that. And let's just see what the errors look like. Let's start out by just going over here and catching our error, and we'll specify that we expect the error to be okay. So it does have an error. Let's actually see what that error looks like. So this error is going to be a Mongo error, and we could maybe just put a couple of things in here. We could look and see that the message contains email, and it also contains dupe. So you could also, go over here, and we've got this error. We're going to look at the error message. So we'll go over here and we'll say the error is actually going to be the error message, and we'll specify that it's going to contain. And we'll say that it's going to contain dupe, which it does. And if you just wanted to go to see it on red first, you could say we expect it not to contain, which ends up failing. So you expect it to contain dupe, and we also expect that it's going to contain email. So the user class is fairly simplistic, right? There's just a couple of things that we really could end up testing here. And part of this is that, we do expect the Mongoose framework to work. This is where we are setting things up. But I think the key takeaway here is that just a little bit of time spent setting up a seed file. And that was another reason I just wanted to make sure that I was connected to the database. I wanted to make sure that I could see the name of the connection. And again, you're seeing the use of promise chains throughout this, right? And it gives you the ability to look at it a little bit at a time and not get bogged down with sort of nested function calls. You can see it's very linear. I'm connecting, I'm removing my pages with and my users with promise.all. I'm creating my users first, and then with my users, I'm creating my pages. And the page object is definitely a little bit more interesting, so the next thing we'll end up doing is we'll take a look at that. So I've got this structure, this test for my user. And I want to show you a couple of features of Mocha that are useful. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to say this is going to be my page model. So right now, if I went to run my test, I would see basically all those things are just duplicated, which is totally fine. Instead of 5 tests, we have tests, 10 of them, but 4 of them are the same. So first thing I want to do is describe a page. And I just want to show you a little trick you could do here is that Mocha gives you the ability to filter out the test that you're running. So you could actually run grep, and I could say I want to grep out for page, and it should just show me these 5 tests. And what I'll do here is just sort of go through these things one by one. We'll start off with page, and this is going to be the page that I'm testing out. Actually, we should actually set it up so that the other tests don't break, so we'll put in user here too. But what I'm going to do here is that I'll go through these one at a time. And I'll say for its existence, I want page to be okay. Right, that's going to be a no-brainer. That'll work. But let's go down here and we'll say find, and we'll say page.find. And this is going to be pages. I called it items before, then I wouldn't have to change this. And this is going to be pages. So by going in here, we can modify this pretty easily, and there's going to be 3 pages. No, there's actually more than that. Let's take a look at our seed file again. So our seed file is showing us that we're going to have 1, 2, 3, 5 pages. So going back here, there are 5. So let's say pages, and let's also fail first. So we'll say the length is equal to 4. And it's telling us we really need to have 5, because that's what it is. So we'll turn this to 5. And so instead of a user without email, let's say a page without content. Well, let's start with the title. So here's our page. We could create it. And what we could do is modify what we end up passing to the page here. Again, we can make this empty and see what our errors are. And we'll say errors dot content dot message has an error. And this will be wrong because it's not email that it's going to be looking for. It's going to be title. And actually I had that reversed. So if we're looking at title, we're going to look at the title message. And let's see that fail. So that fails, and we'll modify this so path title is required. And again, that's what's coming out of the Mongoose framework. So that passes. And then we could say a page without content. And then we'll test out some more of the more interesting methods of the page. So here's our content, and this will be page create. And this will be content message. And again, we'll just get this to fail initially by saying it's equal to name, which it's not. And we'll get it to pass by fixing this and saying it's content. Now we don't have a restriction on the title, although we probably should. So if we end up going back to our seed file, let's actually create a page with the same title. And so let's go over here, try to create a page with that title. And this is going to be our title property. So we'll say a page with a title that exists. And we should have that because, or else you're going to have really orphaned pages that you're never going to be able to get to. And this is going to be title. And let's take a look and we'll see what the error looks like before we decide how to do this. So right now this actually should fail. And it's going to fail because we're not going to, well, let's actually make it so we don't end up getting an error message. Well, let's try this. Okay, expected user validation failed. And this is not user create, this is going to be page create. And let's actually go in and get it to actually fail, because we're expecting it to fail. So if we go back over here, we could go to our models and go to our index and say that title unique is going to be true. It's still not going to end up passing our test, but for a little bit of a different reason here. So let's go back and actually see what that validation looks like. And we'll look at our error. And just to get it to pass, let's actually just do this for the moment. And we'll say error to be okay, which should pass, but then we'll get a little more specific. So here's our error, and we've got these errors that are here. We've got a validation error, so that's for content. And let's actually see if we could get this to I think it's actually passing one thing and not the other, so let's put some content in here. So here's the error that we're looking for, and here we're going to have a message which is going to be title and dupe. So we'll go over here, and this is going to be message, and this is going to be expect error to contain dupe, and we'll also expect error to contain title, right? Because the title is duplicated. You also have when you see that, you also get an idea that Mongoose is doing some validation initially, right, to make sure that the actual properties that are required, but if that ends up passing, then it actually is going to insert them into the collection in the Mongo database. That's when we get this error, and this ends up passing as well. So at this point, we've got some basic tests for our model, but let's actually do a few more of these that are have to do with finding tags and finding similar pages. So let's write a few tests for our page class. In particular, we've got some properties that are being populated before we end up saving. So let's actually test that out, at least test out that it worked. And what we could do, since we have our database seeded, let's move this up to the top so I can see it a little better. So let's say what we're going to do is we're going to describe the URL title. And what we're going to specify is that it replaces spaces with underscores. So let's go in here, and what we can do is we can do a so let's actually write our expectations. Let's say we expect title, which doesn't exist yet, to equal, and we'll say why I love Mongo. This is actually going to be the URL title. So we'll say URL title. And what we'll do to populate that, if we went to run this now, what we can do is we could go and find this page. So we could do before each. Again, passing in a done here. And we could say page find one, and we're going to find it based on the title. And the title is going to be why I love Mongo, because that's what we seeded it with. And then we'll do a then. We'll get a page back. And let's set up a variable out here for URL title. And we'll say URL title equals page.url title. We'll specify done. And we'll go and we'll run this. All right, we're still doing the pages. Now we've got 6 tests that are passing. So let's now do the find by tag. And the ones that I'm going to test out here are that I'm going to look for these two that are the JavaScript tags. So this is how template strings work and destructuring. So that's what I'm going to expect to get here. So let's go up here. I'll put this right underneath, and I'm going to describe find by tag. And I'll write my expectation. So there are to JavaScript tagged pages. And if I actually just grab this over here, what I can do is write this expectation. So I'm expecting these pages, and this is actually going to do a deep equal with the array to just see that the values that are in the array are the same as the values that it's expecting. So what I could do is do a before each. And notice I'm just looking at the strings here, so I'm going to do just a little bit of mapping for this. And I'll set up my variable for pages. And I'll say before each. I'm going to have it done here. And I can specify that I want to do page find by tag. And this is JavaScript. And this is going to be a promise, so then I could then, and I'm going to get some pages, and again, I don't want to overwrite that other variable that's out there. So now I have my pages, and I'm going to say pages are going to be pages.map. So now I'll have a page, and when you're mapping, it's a one-to-one with what you have here, and I'll return page.title. And at this point, I've got my data here, and I specify done. And this should end up passing. All right, so I've got my 7 tests passing. And again, if you just wanted to make sure that the test was doing something, all right, I can make it fail. And then I can go to red here by getting it to pass. So I'm going to do something similar here. In fact, what we'll do is that we'll end up finding one page and then finding similar pages. So in order to find similar pages, let's assume that we'll end up finding this page, how template strings work, and this is going to end up giving us the destructuring page, which is a similar page. So here we'll say this is going to be describe, this is going to be find similar pages. Again, this is a method that's on, this is something that's on an instance of the model. So I do have to get that instance of the model, but what are my expectations are that I'm going to do something similar to what I did over here, but I'm going to specify that the only thing that I expect is going to be the one page, which is going to be the destructuring. So now I have to get this page. So let's actually use this a little bit. We'll say before each, put a done in here. And so I'm going to have to do my page.find1. And this is going to be title is equal to, and I'll pull this out. Come back up here, put that in. So that's going to give me one page. And now once I have that one page, I can do it then. This gives me a page. And again, I could use this promise feature by saying return page find similar, right, which is another promise. I could come down here. This is going to give me pages. Let's set this up here. And this is going to be our pages, and I want to overwrite that variable. So I'm going to say pages equals pages.map, same thing I did before. Return the page.title. And so those are going to be my pages, and I can, at this point, say I'm done. So I've got this variable set up out here. I end up mapping these. And that should be that should do it for my test. And again, if you just did want to see that it was testing what you think it's testing, right, you always want to sort of start out at red and then get to green. So after this, what I want to do is I want to take a look and see how we can test out the routes. So these things are separated out. We can set up our models, and now we'll actually write some tests for the different routes in our application. The next part of this workshop, we're going to want to test our routes out. So we've sort of done some of the lower level tests, which are our models. And the next step is to actually go up one level, because our routes are going to depend on our models working properly. So the first thing that we're going to do is that there is a library called SuperTest, which allows us to wrap around an Express application and make requests to that Express application, and these are going to be the routes that we'll end up testing. So let's install this. And again, we'll just save it as a development dependency. And what we're going to do here is let's actually create another file for our route testing. So we've got our two model tests separated out. Just to keep this at a reasonable clip, let's actually just create a file for testing our routes. So we went over here. We could add a routes spec.js, and we could do a describe for our routes. We'll start out by just testing the route on our home page. So what we could do here, and again, we could always just run our test, grep routes. I'm not going to find any test there, but we could go in and start writing this. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a test. Let's describe our home page. And let's say that our home page is going to, this is really all that's happening with our home page. It's going to have the word pages, so we'll just test for that. So the testing for the routes is a little, as you move up to the sort of higher up that testing pyramid, from the unit test to, again, what we can sort of describe as service tests here, the testing gets to be a little bit more complicated. And then what we're going to do here is that we're going to bring in SuperTest, and what we can do here is we can, I've seen this be called request or agent. Let's call it agent, or could even go as far as calling an app. And we could say that require SuperTest, and SuperTest could wrap around our require, go up one level, our app. So now we've got this SuperTest, which is wrapping around our app, and could save this. And let's actually go in and pull some of these other things that we'll need. We're going to need expect. We're going to need our seed, although we could actually mock some of this stuff out, which we'll do a little bit later on. So here's our user. Here's our page module. Here's our seed. And just to see that we could sort of get things working here, let's just do a before each with a done. And we'll use our seed module, which is just a function that returns a promise. So when this is done, we'll specify that we would like to be done. And what we'll do here is we'll say it has the, well, we could either do the test or we could actually just check that we have a 200. So describe home page, it has the text pages. And so we have our expect here. And so what we can do here is we can make our request. We could say app get slash. And a simple test is to say, hey, look, we're going to expect a 200. And the way that things work with supertest is that you end up passing into your it block a done, because it has to know when you're considering this to be done, because this is going to be asynchronous. And so if we just did this, this would be enough to actually tell us whether or not our test has, our request has gotten a 200 response. Now, we could do it, I'll do it with and without the done, but let's actually just go through and make sure we have this set up correctly. Go back to our test window. Right, this ends up passing. I just want to point out sort of a couple of gotchas here that you should be aware of. If we go up here and we say, let's make it fail. Let's say that we expect it to be a 201. Okay, it'll fail, that's great, but I want to show you something else. If I don't pass done in here, it doesn't know that the test should end up running. And so it's just going to end up timing out. So you have to end up passing done in here, but it could very well be. So we'll get this to pass again. And so the done serves as this callback, which will actually end up running the test, or running the expectations, I should say. So, you know, you might also want to look and see what the content is on the page. So the way that you do that is that there is a end. The end gets passed two things, either an error or a response. And since this is a page that we're getting back, right, in the form of HTML, we could do an expectation, and we could specify that we expect the response.text, in our case, to contain pages. Now, one of the things that we have to remember to do, well, I'll show you this. So response, this is going to be res, okay. So again, this times out because we didn't end up calling done. Let's call done. Okay, let's now get it to fail. And it'll show us the text that we got. We don't get what we're expecting. It's actually showing the entire content of that page. So now we have it passing and we're green. But I just want to show you one last thing. You have the ability to chain these things. So if I was to go over here and say, all right, well, I expect 500, okay? What's going to happen is that even though there's an error with that, it's still going to show that it's passing. And the reason for that is that it's my responsibility to go in here and look to see whether or not I have an error. The way that you do this is you say, if there is an error in the above, any of the above tests, then what I want to do is I want to just get out of there, done, and with done, I could actually pass in my error. So it'll say what actually failed. And so now I go to red because it's saying you expected a 500, you got a 200, and at this point, I'll go and make this a 200, and I end up passing. So this is just the first example of going in and setting up our super test. And again, the key takeaways here are that it is wrapping around our app. And again, that'll work because our app has our routes in it. We're not starting a server on our own. We don't have to. We are seeding our data here. And also, when we end up going in here, we have the ability of setting expectations and actually looking at the result. But you just have to remember that if you're chaining some of these expectations, and we'll do this a little bit more, that you have to explicitly look and see whether you have an error, because it's not going to end up showing you that you had an error, and also critical that you end up calling done. Now let's make things a little bit more interesting. Let's actually write a test for one of the wiki pages. So we could take this test that we have here, which is describing a home page, and let's describe a wiki page. So here, just to make sure we didn't break anything, we can see that we'll get 2 tests passing. And let's go back over here and change this to a wiki page. So we know that we have a page which is titled Why I Love Mongo, and this is from our seed file, right, which you recall here. Our title is Why I Love Mongo. So we know that when we access that, we're accessing that with a URL, which is going to be the URL version of the title, right, the URL title property. So we will go to wiki, and our test will be why I love Mongo. And we should expect, again, another 200. And we should expect to see the text, why I love Mongo. So again, there should be another 200. We make sure that we sort of sniff out for errors, and let's just get this to pass. It passes, but again, it's always nice to go from red to green. So if we said, why I hate Mongo, that's going to fail. Let's switch this back. Passes. And if we just go back up here again, I just want to point this out, that if we were to go here and say this is going to be 302 or something, right, this is going to fail. And again, the reason why it's failing, just wanted to point it out again, is that we're dealing with this error over here. So let's switch this back to 200, and that's going to pass as well. So let's actually do one that's a little bit more interesting. And what we'll do is we'll do a test to see that we can end up adding a page. So in this case, we're actually going to be dealing with another method of the app. So the same way that the app can do a GET request, the app can do a POST request as well. Now, we know that when we end up posting, the way that our app works is that it ends up redirecting back to that page. And that's something that we could end up testing for. So what we could do here, let's again go and copy this. So we've got our home page, we've got our wiki, and what we'll test here is adding a wiki. And what we could do is say it redirects and instead of getting, what we're going to do is post. So the action that we end up posting to is /wiki. That's our route. And since we're posting, we're going to be sending some data. So we could specify what we're going to be sending. And we could specify that our title is going to be, let's say, 1601F. There's a couple of other things that we're going to need to do this. We're going to need some content. We also have to specify an email, which is going to be the email for the user. And we could put a tag in. And also, we need the name of the user. So once we do this, we could figure out what we expect. Now, one of the things that we're going to be expecting here is that if we go to look at our code and we end up looking under our routes, we're going to see that for our wiki route, when we end up doing a post, here we're doing this find and create, and we're going to redirect to the route of the page that ended up getting inserted. So if that's what we want to test out, that's what we should actually test here. And what we can do for our expectations is to specify what we expect, and this, again, this is something that comes with supertest, is to say that our location is going to be, and I'm going to put the wrong one down here initially. So we could say that we expect our location, and that's going to happen when you end up redirecting. We're not going to look at any text. We really only care that we're redirecting to the right page. We're not going to look at the content, because in essence, this would be the content that would be on the wiki page. So if we go to run this, we should see that it expected a location of users, but ended up getting wiki 1601F, and that's actually what we expect. So we expect that it's going to go to wiki 1601 underscore F, which is going to be the URL title. And our test will end up passing. So this test here is pretty useful, right? It's making sure that we can end up posting. And the difference between posting and getting is that with posting, you're sending some data. And here you're also seeing that you can set an expectation as to what the redirect location is going to be, and supertest makes that pretty easy to do. So let's actually take a look at another test that we could do here. Let's actually test out. We have a users route that's here, and let's test that out. So we expect our users to have the names of our users on the page. So this is a fairly easy one here. We could say describe users. And let's actually be a little bit more descriptive here. So we could specify this is going to be a get for a wiki page, and this is going to be a get for users. And so when we end up testing the users, we're going to say it will show the users. We can make this fail a couple of different ways just to make this interesting. But really what we're going to end up doing here is we're going to say agent, and we'll say get / users. Let's say that we expect a 200. We'll say end, and we'll pass in this function, which will get our error and also our response. And we'll do this standard thing to say, hey, look, if you have any error, then return done with the error, and let's make sure that we end up putting done over here in our if block. And once we end up doing that, we could specify that we expect, and now we could actually look at our response dot text to contain, we have two users that are here, professor, and we will also say John Doe. And if we go over here, we could specify done, and we should be able to run that test. Okay, so agent is not defined, right, because we didn't call it agent, we called it request. We called it app, actually. Let's put that on one line, that's better. So that ends up passing, and you can make this fail any number of ways, but one thing we could always do here is actually go into the views themselves. We've got this user list page, and we could go over here and here's our username. Could actually just delete that out. Go to red, go back here, put it back in, and go to green. Again, the idea is you always want to make sure that you went from red to green, that you're testing what you think that you're testing. So at this point, we've now tested our users page. And there's a couple of other things that we could end up doing here. One of the things that we had spoken about was the idea that we could end up stubbing things out. So we're testing out our users page, but let's actually just do a spy. We know that on our users page, the user find method is being called. And what we're going to do here is that if we go over to our spec, we're going to say get users. Let's actually just add another test for this. So my goal here is that we'll start looking a little bit at spying, and we're going to use a node module called sign-on. So let's install that. And this is going to be save dev. And we're going to end up bringing sign-on in here. And we'll say sign-on. Let's just make sure our tests still pass. So we've got this users thing twice. Let's just go down here. Let's modify this. We're going to have two different users tests. Again, just to show you two things that we're testing. We can put this in one test if we want. I'm going to say test spy. So when I go in here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say spy equals sign on spy. And what am I going to spy on? I'm going to spy on user. And I'm going to spy on the find method. And so when I go down here, nothing really should happen here. It should pass the same way. I've got a valid spy here. But I'm going to go down here and actually also, when testing this, I'm going to say expect, and I'll say spy called to be okay, meaning it was called. Now I get something kind of interesting here. So we see that the spy is called, and actually that's really not testing this correctly, right? Because if there's an error here, well, no, that actually should work. Let's do a console.log just so we see what that is. So we see spy called is true with user.find. Let's just take a quick look at how that's being called. So we've got our routes for users, and we see that find is being called, and that passes. So there's actually, that works out fine, right? So we could test that as spy. Now, let's say that one of the things that we wanted to do was also have some functionality so that if in fact there weren't any users on the page, we would want to have some message that said you don't have any users there. And we could go in and we could run a seed and get rid of all of our pages. But the other thing we could do, and it's kind of worth demonstrating here, is that we could actually do a stub method. So here's our spy. And what I'm going to do over here, I'm going to do a stub. Well, I think that this will give you enough information to sort of understand how spies and stubs are working or how you would end up using them. And what I'm going to do here is that when I go to get users, I'm going to say test stub. And what I'm going to be looking to do here, I'm not doing it right now, but I'm going to expect my test to say there are no users. Now this should fail. Okay? I'm not necessarily going to be testing my SPY here. In fact, I'm going to take this out and take this out. And if I go over here, I'll see that that fails because I do have users and there's nothing in that in the text that should end up showing up. And in any event, we don't have the logic in our application for this to work. So this is a little bit of test-driven development that you're seeing here. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say sign on stub. What am I stubbing? I'm going to stub user find. And so we actually looked at this in class, and what I'm going to return from here, don't forget that find ends up returning a promise. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually resolve that promise, and I'm going to resolve that promise with an empty array of users. So let me actually go up here, make sure I've got my Bluebird library, although you could, at this point, you could probably use the built-in promise library, but I've gotten comfortable with this. Has some additional methods that we could end up using. So here's with the Bluebird library, I'm going to stub this out, and I'm going to say return, and I could say promise resolve. So it is a promise, it is thenable, and I'm returning a promise that will resolve with this empty array. Now again, I still should end up failing, but let's actually see what we run into here. So I'm running into a situation where it's attempting to wrap find, which is already wrapped. So let's see why that's the case. So let's go up here. We're stubbing. And the problem that we have here is that we need to actually go in and we need to restore this. So what I'm going to do up here is I'm going to, there's a couple of different ways that you could do this. Sort of a quick and dirty way is to say, here's our SPY. When we get done and we're down here, we're going to say user.find. And we're going to end up restoring it. And so now that error will end up going away. But I get another error here. And the error that I get is that user.findExec is not a function. There's a couple of different ways that I could handle this. Initially, what I tried to do is to so it's actually the user.findExec methods. I should call find and exec. Now, one thing, again, Mongoose has changed a little bit, probably from when this was first done, but you can actually get away without putting exec here. And this is going to be thenable, in which case, if I go to run this again, so I've got my timeout, which is kicking in over here. So this is really an issue of this timing out because this test is failing. So let's actually get this test to pass. And just a slight modification here is that we're just going to put an if statement here. And we'll say if users.length is equal to 0, and we'll do an end if. And let's put a div here, and we could put in the div, there are no users. And let's see if we have our text correct there. Let's actually rerun this test. right? And this is still failing, but I think it's failing because we have a different text here. Let's see what our text is. There are no users. So that looks correct. So this is interesting because the thing that that I thought was failing is not actually failing. The test that's failing is that it has the text pages, which is for my wiki page. And the reason why it's failing is that whenever you end up stubbing something out, right, you have to actually unstub it. So that once we end up getting down here in my test, so the issue really is that this test is running before this test. And so when I end up calling find, what ends up happening is that I'm basically overriding what find does, and find is always returning an empty array. So really what I need to do here is that once I end up stubbing and I'm done stubbing, and this is probably better done in a before each and an after each, is to say user.find, and I'm going to restore it. So you can't wrap things twice, and also if you end up wrapping something, you really have to unwrap it because you're wrapping it for the method, and if another place uses it, you want to make sure it doesn't end up calling your stub. So now if we do that, our test will end up passing. So again, the key here is, and we should actually pull this out into a before each and an after each, is that if we're sort of testing this stub out, we could go in here and do a before each. And here there's nothing that's going to be asynchronous. Before each, I'm going to attach my stub. And after each, when I'm done, I'm going to restore it. So again, this is just making clear that what is actually being tested and what's being stubbed. And again, the key here is that you have this other request that's being made here where find is being used. And if you end up stubbing it, you have to unstub it. And we can demo this real fast. Let's see that this works. And I'm going to forget to restore it. And that wiki page will end up timing out. And now I restore it. And I end up getting to that page. So that's something that's pretty helpful to do, being able to stub something out. Now again, we're not usually for your own application. I think you're more likely to, this looks a little weird, you're more likely to end up seeding data and actually testing it with real data. But if you did have some service that was a third-party call, more than likely you'd want to stub that out. And again, if you decided to stub it with something else, you just have to make sure that you would end up restoring it because you can't stub it or spy on it twice. So I should say you can't do that without restoring it. Let's do one other thing. Let's do a little test-driven development for something that we don't have at the moment, which is deleting a page. And let's specify what we expect to have happen here. So we're going to delete a wiki page. So even though we don't have a route that ends up doing this yet, we want to stub out that functionality. So let's actually think about how that is going to end up working. First of all, we're going to say that when we stub it, let's say that we want to make sure that it redirects to the wikis page. And so instead of doing a get, we're going to expect this route to be a delete. And instead of expecting a 200, when something is removed, we're going to do a 204. Actually, this is going to be a redirect, so we wouldn't end up doing that. If this was an AJAX request, we would end up doing that. So this is actually going to be a 302. But let's actually test this out. We actually did this before. More importantly, let's test out that our delete is going to be expect the location, and this is going to go to /wiki. And when we're done with this, there's nothing else that we're going to test out. We want to make sure that this goes back to wiki. This route doesn't exist at this point. If we go to run this, we'll get a failing test because we can't even test out that route. So let's test out that route by going into our user's route. And what we'll do here is that when we end up, we already should have a get route, and I should actually say my wiki route. We've got a get route for our URL title, which is going to be over here. And so what we could do is we could do a delete route for our URL title. And let's actually go in here and we'll specify that we're going to see page remove and what conditions the URL title is equal to request params URL title. And again, this is going to be a promise. So when we get back from here, let's actually just say response.redirect, and we'll redirect to /wiki. So now this should end up passing. Let's see why our router is not picking that up. So I've got a typo here, and this should be expect. Right, I expect my location to be /wiki. And now this should end up passing. And again, if you wanted to sort of get it to fail first, you could always end up doing that. So it'll tell you that expected XWiki, but we got wiki, and now we could go to green. So, and there's other things you could do here. If you wanted to, test this out, you might want to spy on your your remove method and see that it's getting called. That's something else that you could end up doing. But this would be an example of where you could, we went in, we didn't have the route at all. We ended up writing our test, and then we actually went in and put in our route. So now it would just be a question of wiring up the delete route so that our UI could call it when we ended up clicking on the delete link. So that does it for our workshop with testing. And again, my sort of big takeaway is to spend a little bit of time being able to seed some data puts you in a very sort of well-defined position with your data. When you end up doing that, you could go in, and the other thing that I think is sort of worth seeing here is the idea that the unit tests themselves are fairly painless to do. I mean, going in here and actually just seeding our data and just testing out some of our methods. So if you had some more complex methods here on the user class, you could actually, user model, you could actually go and test them out. And again, when we go up one level to our routes, it becomes a little bit more of an integration test, or what we called in the presentation a service test. And the reason for that is that we really have two things that we're combining here. If we really wanted to, we could separate them out. Nothing would really prevent us from, stubbing out all of our actual calls to our database. But since it's so easy for us to seed our database and it's a pretty fast process, that's not necessarily something that is commonly stubbed out. But you could actually stub out method calls that might be hitting a third-party API and still have a pretty high confidence that your application is working the way it's supposed to. And that's really about it.